Good afternoon. My name is Sandis Šrāders. I'm the lecturer at the Baltic Defense College and the MA program director. Today, I have the pleasure to open discussion for the Riga Security Forum 2023 on what kind of challenges has China brought to the global security arena in terms of nuclear weapons and arsenal. For small, big states, I think it's a very topical challenge. And I have the pleasure to invite Lynn Rusten from Nuclear Threats Initiative, and she's a vice president of the Global Nuclear Program at the Institute. She has very long bio and she has worked with different kind of challenges. I just have to mention the major ones. That she has been actively engaging with the White House, with the Congress, and also the Department of State with such important challenges as verification and checks on sites. And most importantly, I think there's one salient aspect that stands out, the New START Treaty, which will expire in February of 2026. And I think this challenge for mostly for Russia, but also for the global community of which we are part, poses important questions and that need to be answered now to make sure we are in the smooth transition hopefully with a better treaty, less nuclear arms, and more balance among the nuclear powers. I have the pleasure to welcome Lynn Rusten to ask, what do you think are the major challenges internationally relating to the nuclear arms? One is the proliferation and the treaty, non-proliferation treaty, which has been the backbone of global security affairs, or the possibility, for example, some of the countries like Russia have rattled their nuclear arsenal against Ukraine, and other countries saying like, this is my turf, stand out. And this raises like multiple questions about this return of geopolitics. So Lynn Rusten, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me and to talk about these important issues. Clearly it's a really challenging time in terms of nuclear security and nuclear arms control. The entire fabric and structure of agreements that has helped to manage nuclear competition, and particularly in the Euro-Atlantic, has been fraying and eroding over the last really couple of decades. And so we are now at the point where the last remaining agreement regulating nuclear competition between the United States and Russia is New START, and it is set to expire. Obviously, this is in the context of the terrible war in Ukraine, and very high tensions between Russia and the West. And it's really concerning. And of course, in the context of that war, Russia has even stopped implementing aspects of the treaty in terms of the verification, inspections, and the exchange of information. And the United States has followed suit. Now, both are abiding by the limits, which is very important. But the question is, what will happen when the treaty expires in February of 2026? There does need to be a successor agreement, but right now, because the countries aren't even at the table talking about that, I fear that it's very likely that the agreement will go out of force without a successor in place. So that's really concerning.
I think this nuclear cooperation has been one of the few issues that render Russia relevant to the United States and puts kind of on the same shelf. As you mentioned, there have been like already caveats and challenges to the cooperation, especially when it comes to the inspections and compliance on site. But some of the caveats were results of COVID, where simply we restricted the movement of the people and inspectors and those experts across the borders, like in the United States and also in Russia. How do you see this evolving or soil for a better agreement, I hope, where the nuclear arsenal will be capped, and my hope is it's going to be decreased, and at some point we might hopefully enter nuclear-free global affairs in terms of military power. Let's leave the atoms for peace where they are. They are sometimes very good. But what do you see that might be main obstacles for this treaty, or do you think even in those pressing and complicated conditions, Ukraine, Russia, the West versus the rest, when there really seems very little we can agree on, what are the major obstacles for this treaty?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the most challenging aspects of the current moment is that for the first time, it seems that Russia in particular, and arguably maybe the West and the United States too, are not as willing as they used to be to completely insulate nuclear issues from other problems and challenges in the relationships. I mean, we have a more than 50-year history of nuclear arms control agreements with the former Soviet Union and Russia to regulate these, to limit them, to reduce them. And we've done that, we did that in the height of the Cold War when we were having proxy wars all over the world and had major, ideological differences and competition. But we, isolated that area as an area of mutual sort of existential common interest where we could make deals and make progress insulated from some of the other challenges in the bilateral relationship. At the current moment, that doesn't seem to be where we are, and we see President Putin basically putting higher priority right now on his war aims and trying to get leverage over us by kind of holding arms control hostage to concessions that clearly the United States and the West more broadly are not going to make in terms of pulling back on support for Ukraine or whatever he's hoping for, President Putin. But at the same time, so it's a pretty discouraging state of affairs right now, but I also think that fundamentally it is still an interest, first of all, that despite Putin's coercion, that nuclear weapons, not be used, and that they continue to be regulated, and that there not be an unbounded and frankly expensive and unsustainable arm race. So I do think that at some point, perhaps only after the hot fighting in Ukraine stops, there will be a return to the table. And then when we get there, it's going to be a complicated discussion because I think any future agreement will have to include everything that's included in New START, plus some of Russia's new novel strategic systems, and then a discussion about other capabilities that affect strategic stability. We have our list, like non-strategic nuclear weapons, since Russia has a preponderance of those. They are always wanting to include in the conversation precision strike conventional systems, missile defense. So it's going to be a complex negotiation, but I think there's still enough, overlap that, an agreement could be reached. It will be further complicated by China's rising nuclear force, which is creating a lot of debate already and consideration in the United States of whether and how that might affect what United States feels that are its what we call requirements for nuclear weapons. And so up until now, China and any other country have been considered like lesser included cases. So whatever we felt that we needed to deter Russia would be sufficient, and everything else kind of fell under that. There's now kind of a debate about, given the projected expansion of China's nuclear forces, is it a different situation now? And could that change what the United States feels that it needs to have in terms of nuclear forces? And then how does that fit in with trying to reach an agreement with Russia? So it's a complex picture.
Thank you so much. And it doesn't matter how complicated these conversations had been in the past. There has always been some kind of agreement, 5 or 10 years or something, and it has usually served the global stability built on bilateral, bipolar competition, but also stability. And you already touched upon something I really wanted to ask. Recently, Xi Jinping met Biden in the United States. And I'm guessing if they were touching upon the issue where China is building up its stockpile. Especially disconcerting for small powers in East Asia, like for example Taiwan, Japan, but also the others, the rocket force. How do you think that China's stockpiling of nuclear arms will affect the global stability? Because I feel like we are inching into multilateral competition, which might be much more unstable than the old good classical contest between the United States, Soviet Union, and Russia. I was hoping it might remain like this, but since China is a major power, it has all the rights to owe and be recognized as it is the legitimate nuclear power and the member of the permanent five. But how this will affect practically the global stability and global security in Eurasia, especially?
Well, of course, that's a really important question, and let me first just step back and say that the agreement between President Biden and President Xi, or the fact of their meeting, was very important. They had not met in person for an entire year, and of course, relations have been very frosty at best. And so I think one of the most significant things to come out of this meeting was the decision to resume military-to-military contacts. And it sounds like it's a very fulsome resumption, because they're talking about not just at the most senior levels of the secretaries of defense and the head of the armed forces on both sides, but also kind of a series of other mechanisms at lower levels between the two military departments. And very importantly, there's an agreement having to do with maritime. It's kind of like the incidents at sea agreement that we have that the United States has with Russia, and to have regional theater commanders regularly in communication. And these channels are so important for many reasons. I mean, one is we've seen a real uptick in our militaries in close proximity in the region, and the risk of accident, the kind of things where you see where a Chinese, plane, surveillance plane, flies extremely close to U.S. surveillance plane, or is buzzing over one of our, ships in the Asia Pacific. And those incidents are very, very dangerous. And they can lead to all kinds of unintended consequences and conflict. If God forbid there was a collision, military personnel died, it leads to one thing or another. And so I think the fact that they are resuming conversations on that tactical operational level is important, and hopefully they're going to kind of pull back from some of these risky behaviors that really risk human tragedy and unintended escalation. That's number one. And then number two, this larger issue of we really have a lack of dialogue with China just about understanding each other's actions and strategic intentions. In the nuclear sphere, we don't know exactly why they are suddenly poised to expand their nuclear forces in a very significant way. I mean, they're considered to have about 500 nuclear weapons now. They used to be steady state in the 200 to 300 level. They're now projected to have, at least by our military and intelligence community, to have as many as I think 1,500 by 2035, and 1,000 by, I don't know, the late 2020s. So that's a very significant change in their posture and presumably their doctrine, but they're not talking about it. And so I think if we're able to have a dialogue, not only at the military to military level, but also in diplomatic channels, about actions and capabilities and intent, that's very important. And of course, it's also important not just about military forces themselves, but about the things that it looks like the president did indeed talk about, policies and intentions around Taiwan on both sides, as an example, activities in the South China Sea. So the need for dialogue is great. I think this is a good beginning. They're clearly sending a top-down signal to both governments to get many channels going. But it is an interesting contrast with the long history of dialogue between the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia, where we have of course, they're not in operation right now, but we actually have long and good habits about being able to talk about these things. And I think both kind of have shared a view that transparency is a net benefit for security, whereas I'm not sure China thinks that. I think China thinks it benefits from obscurity. So it'll be, I think it'll be a long process in terms of developing habits of communication that can be stabilizing.
Thank you so much. Your statements and all the ideas remind me when the times are most difficult and when security issues are the most pressing, it's time to talk. And I was really happy to see that the Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden were meeting in the United States, and I very much hope that the majority of their points were about security and about the cooperation instead of lack of it. And we have seen how the lack of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union have played badly, misperceptions, as you said, escalations of smaller conflicts into bigger ones, how these instances actually undermine our security. But in those difficult times, when each side, the Americans, the Russians, and the PRC seem to be reluctant to cooperate in other areas while they are still having some dialogue in terms of security. I very much hope that there are so many exchanges that we don't know publicly. What do you think? What is their common are there issues they are still able to work with and cooperate with? And what are the major challenges that bind them together in terms of non-proliferation? I think all sides, including the Europeans, Germans, European Union, they were working together to make sure Iran doesn't acquire nuclear capability. North Korea has become really menacing in terms of use and application and technology relating to its nuclear capability. What do you think should be the common stance of those nuclear powers? And it doesn't matter how difficult the body language looks like and how fractured the international security arena looks like. Do you think they should work together, and where in terms of non-proliferation?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point and question. And I do think the interest in non-proliferation and ensuring that additional states don't acquire nuclear weapons, let alone, terrorists and third parties, is an enduring shared interest. And they also have a very strong interest in maintaining and strengthening the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which helps to ensure that no additional countries acquire nuclear weapons, but yet at the same time facilitates their benefiting from the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, like in medicine and nuclear power, which we know is increasingly important given climate change. But again, I think we're at an unfortunate point where, while they do have that shared interest, none of them are prioritizing it over other objectives. And so we are in a really concerning moment in terms of, as you say, that, North Korea is just, accelerating its, acquisition of nuclear capability and missiles. And there's sufficient, I think, political capital being put on trying to negotiate, get North Korea back to the table and negotiate and try to rein in its increased militarization. You've got Russia right now more interested in buying weapons, conventional weapons, to prosecute its war in Ukraine than it is in putting constraints on North Korea. It doesn't seem to be as big a priority for China right now. And even the United States, you can arguably say that it's not, we're distracted by the war, or not distracted, but we're understandably focused on the war in Ukraine. We're understandably focused on the relationship with China. And now we're unplanned, but unexpectedly very focused on the crisis in the Middle East, which has the potential to escalate even more horrifically than it has. And so, you don't see a lot of priority right now on North Korea. And it's clear that our allies in South Korea are concerned about the sort of relative inattention. So it's a problem. But again, I think it's, I think it's a problem that's not going away without the active engagement of the countries I just spoke about. And I think there is a mutual interest in avoiding conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So I think we'll come back to it. And it is interesting that one of the few multilateral mechanisms that's still a little bit functional is what's called the P5 dialogue. So it's the P5, of course, are the United States, China, Russia, France, and the UK, the recognized nuclear powers and UN Security Council members. And within the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty context, they are meeting regularly at a working level. They're talking about things like nuclear policies and doctrines, and their obligation under the treaty toward disarmament. The fact that progress is not being made on that at the moment is a source of real contention within the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, and non-nuclear weapon states are very frustrated and angry about this. So it's interesting that channel of dialogue is ongoing. The chair rotates, and it happens to be Russia who's chairing it right now for the next year or so. And so it'll actually be interesting to see what happens in those channels. But at least there's a little, it's sort of like an ember in a fireplace. I mean, there's a little something, ember still staying warm at a low level. And hopefully when the political conditions improve, there'll be more robust dialogue, and I hope a return to actual real negotiations.
Thank you so much. In this contest and competition, and you already mentioned two of the permanent 5 members, the Europeans, the French and the Brits, and also India, that is a nuclear power, but not a legitimate one. What do you think Europeans and leadership in New Delhi could do to enhance the stability of this nuclear balance, which has been dwelling on Russia and the United States primarily, but now China is planning to increase its nuclear stockpile and arm itself, the rocket force, and many countries in the region are very concerned. Then there are the Western allies and derivatives, I would say, NATO, European derivatives that are non-members like Japan, outside from the transatlantic community. But Germany, what is your opinion? Should they also plan to increase their missile capability, non-nuclear, but maybe missile capability that might at least regionally stabilize this security competition?
Well, I would hate to see an introduction of intermediate range missiles more in the Euro-Atlantic region or in Asia. Of course, they're both specific. They're different cases. Of course, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range, Nuclear Forces Treaty between the United States and Russia that banned that class of missiles globally among those two countries, unfortunately is now out of force. Before the war in Ukraine, there were conversations about, possibly restoring a moratorium. The devil is completely in the details, because the whole reason the agreement fell apart was because we believed that Russia had illegally, surreptitiously deployed a missile in this category. But still, if we could, I think there needs to be some reconstitution of constraints on both conventional and nuclear forces, in and around the Euro-Atlantic region. I would much rather see us going in the direction of constraining that capability than putting more into Europe, and certainly not more nuclear. I think it's important it's really tricky to find the line between sort of what do you need for deterrence, versus what's just going to fuel on, action and reaction. And I'd say with nuclear weapons in particular, they're really not practical, usable weapons. I think it's much more important to have, reliable conventional capability as a deterrent, backed up, of course, by the extended deterrence offered by the United States and the UK and France. But if anything, I think we should be working toward getting nuclear weapons out of the Atlantic, and I certainly mean Russia's, as opposed to loading them up and having a risk of use and escalation, because I think any idea that nuclear war could be limited or contained or wouldn't be consequential is just wrong.
The last question, and probably the one that concerns myself as a Latvian, but also the other Baltic states and probably all states around the Baltic Sea and in Europe very much, is the expiration of the agreement, like 2026 February. And probably there are some non-military leverages that Europeans, the allies for the United States in the framework of NATO, but also in all other ways. We invest in each other. It's like, and we are good partners for many decades and multiple 100 years to come. But my question is like, can you name like 3 major things, or at least one to 3? What could Europe do to help Americans sign balanced treaty past February 2026? What is that Europeans could do to support the United States in order to leave Russia without fewer demands for any concessions?
Sure. First of all, it would be good for Europeans to make clear to both Russia and the United States that you want them to maintain, limits on their nuclear forces and to negotiate a new agreement, but also in the interim, until that's completed, to at least agree as a political commitment, if New START actually expires, to continue to abide by its limits. So that's number one. I think number two, even before we get there, and this goes back to something that was touched on earlier, I think we have to stop using or thinking of diplomacy as a reward for good behavior. We have to, permit, and it would be good for Europe, as distasteful as it is, to support dialogue between the United States and Russia on nuclear matters. And I think there's some debate on this within NATO about, whether to have dialogue with Russia about whether Putin's trustworthy. Of course, he's not trustworthy, but there's trust but verify. We need verifiable agreements, and we can't just wait for to see when there's going to be a different Russian leader, because unfortunately, I think Putin is the leader they have until they don't, and we can't control that. But we also can't. So I think understanding that dialogue and diplomacy, even with a distasteful adversary, which, by the way, is not new. We did it with Iran. We've done it with Soviet leaders. I mean, can be a necessary thing for our mutual security. And I've had a third thought, but I can't remember what it was.
Well,
I think maybe the other, I will say one third one is to be thinking about also, for when conditions are right, thinking in a serious, practical a way about how can arms control, and I mean that in the broadest sense, not just formal legally binding agreements, but commitments, norms, transparency. How can that help to mitigate the security threats, particularly emanating from Russia, that Europe is rightly concerned about? It's a tool along with military capability that can enhance security, and to be thinking hard about that is what we want from Russia. And but along with that, what we as an alliance, or as countries with common interests, are prepared to give to get that, because agreements are not one-sided. We can say that we want Russia to do A, B, and C, including dramatically reduce its non-strategic nuclear weapons, but there's got to be some overlap of interest or things that both sides are being willing to do, and it doesn't have to be the same. It can be asymmetrical in terms of what we might agree to and what they agree to, but the whole package of the agreement is something that serves both sides' interests. And that's kind of the ultimate aim. So having that pre-planning discussion internally in the West in terms of, what would we like to see in terms of a reconstruction of a European security architecture that helps constrain the threats we see from Russia? What does that look like, and how might it be possible to achieve that? That's really hard work, and we should be starting to talk about that and think about that together.
Thank you so much. What we want in Europe from Russia is peace, and probably the result of the peace might mean showing some strength and solidarity within Europe and also with the United States. I would like to conclude this conversation on China, nuclear threats, Russia and the United States, all bind together by the nuclear power and different kind of agreements. I very much hope these agreements will not only last, but we will sign much better ones in the future. My name is Sandis Šrāders, lecturer at the Baltic Defense College. I had the pleasure to talk to Lynn Rusten, Nuclear Threats Initiative Vice President of Global Nuclear Policy Program. Thank you very much, Lynn, for this. And with this, I would like to conclude this conversation.